Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clare Dalton, and I'm your moderator for today. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another episode of the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week web series. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly impacted us all and challenged us in ways we could not have imagined. Innovation and technology are vital in ensuring that developing nations and emerging economies recover from this pandemic. So today we'll discuss how technology and innovation has helped. We have about 45 minutes. I'll first briefly set the scene a little from the perspective of my organization, and then we'll speak to two very experienced people to talk about their perspectives. Now, it's been over a year since this pandemic hit. There have been countless impacts, suffering, deaths. People's lives, livelihoods have been affected. Society itself has been impacted. Now, my organization largely works in conflict, and really conflicts are the sharp end of any pandemic. We may find it a challenge in countries where the services are good and the government is fully able to respond. Imagine how much harder that is in places impacted by war and conflict. So I think for humanitarian organizations, this pandemic has brought a really specific set of challenges. Just one example, we estimate around 60 million people around the world live under the control of an armed group, which means they don't have access to government services. So maybe they won't get vaccines, maybe they won't be able to access health services. And this, of course, is a challenge for all of us in one sense or another. So I think, the point I wanted to make is, I think this pandemic's been about three main challenges. Obviously, it's been about a lot, but the first is an access challenge. I'm talking from the point of view of humanitarian organizations. Access to people, the access people have to the services they need, and the access we might have as humanitarians to places we need to work in. It's also a capacity challenge, because many of our responses have been affected because we've had to reduce our capacity in one sense or another. And I think thirdly is something that's not often talked about, but I think it's a mental health challenge. I think the psychological toll of this pandemic, is also something that needs to be considered. Just a very small fact, as us for a humanitarian organization, right now, a year after this pandemic started, still 1% of the contexts we work in, we have a critical impact on our response, which basically means we can't work. 6% of our operations are strained, which again, that's an extreme result. And about 73% of operations have been moderately impacted, which essentially means in 80% of the places we work, some of the hardest to reach places with people, with really severe needs, we're not necessarily able to do our jobs as we should be able to. So how can technology and innovation help? Well, this is what we're here to talk about today. And it's technology and innovation under any circumstances, an opportunity to change for the better, to be better for people, to be better organizations, and to be better partners. It's about taking risks, learning, sharing, driving improvements. And these are all things I think, in a positive sense, this pandemic has helped us do. There's a lot of negative impacts, but there are positive impacts in the way we've had to adapt. And just, very briefly, we've had to develop digital solutions to overcome some of these access challenges. I'll just give a couple of examples. We do a lot of training, capacity training. This is normally face-to-face. What if you can't do something face-to-face? What are the alternatives? Well, we've been exploring VR, developing tools using virtual reality to help bring that sensory experience necessary to help people learn and exchange expertise. Actually, this might be better than some of the face-to-face solutions, depending on what it is you're working on. We've also developed tools to help us in the work we do restoring family links, or helping people who've been separated by war and conflict get back in contact with family members. And my reflection on this is we should have done this a long time ago. We should have had digital solutions to some of these challenges. But again, this pandemic has helped, push us to scale this up quicker, move from paper-based tools to electronic and digital tools. And then finally, in places that are very difficult to work in for various reasons, maybe we need to share expertise. So we develop apps that can help us work together with our partners on the ground when we maybe aren't able to be physically with them. And we use things like AI and remote sensing to identify say a water point, or to assess damage to infrastructure. So these are all things I think that, we've had to develop because of these challenges. Now, in each of these examples, partnership between public and private entities is vital. We wouldn't find these solutions without those kinds of partnerships. And I think that's where technology and innovation can really help us all recover from this pandemic. So that's exactly why I want to now talk to our two very distinguished speakers to further discuss this and look at how we can best drive a sustainable recovery. I won't try and introduce them. I'd much rather they tell you in their own words who they are and what their companies do. So without further ado, I'd like to start with Mr. Sudheer Perla, who is the Vice President of Business Development at Tabreed. So Sudheer, how have you seen the work that you're doing change since this pandemic began?
Sure. Thanks, Claire, for that, and thanks for setting the stage extremely clear in terms of what the challenges have been and how the world is recovering post, I wouldn't say post-COVID, but at least in this new world, essentially. I mean, just before I go into your question, I mean, I basically work for Tabreed. Tabreed is a Dubai-listed, Abu Dhabi headquartered district cooling utility. And essentially what we've been doing for the last 22 years and continue to do is provide cooling as a service, essentially through more sustainable, cost-effective options versus individual developers meeting the cooling requirements by themselves, right? So, and we've been looking at expanding into new markets beyond the GCC, and I'm right now looking at our expansion into countries like India, where cooling demand is exponentially growing, right? So, in terms of how our work has changed, I would say, or the need for the kind of services that we provide, I would think that, I mean, generally speaking, it's encouraging to see that there's a lot more focus on sustainability and trying to build the world post this the pandemic in a more sustainable way, right? So there's a lot more focus on general sustainable growth pretty much across the spectrum. And as a company, since we've been doing that for a while now, it is just bringing what we're doing a lot more into I would say into the focus. And talking about the problems that you mentioned on access, right? I mean, on, say, for example, the challenges on access and so on. It's funny how, I mean, the pandemic or not, I mean, we now live in a world where there is abundant capital available, yet capital doesn't reach places where it needs to. You have pretty much all the technology solutions that you need in the world to kind of solve most of the problems that we currently have. But there is still this gap in terms of market linkages, in terms of how this can go through to exactly where it's required. Right. So whilst you have the technologies, they're not going where they need to. Whilst you have the capital is not going where it needs to. You have abundant information, and yet there is information asymmetry in terms of people being able to pick the right choices that are required. I mean, to essentially solve most of the complex problems that we have. So as a company, essentially, I mean, what we've been doing is trying to solve this market access problem, where by enabling technologies and the capital that is available out there to meet an essential need, which is becoming more and more essential, which is cooling, in a more cost-effective and sustainable way, right? And it's kind of only becoming more relevant now, post-COVID. But yeah, I probably could go on later, but I will let Pia.
Thank you. And I think what you say on access, and like you say that, a lot of what we need is there. It's just, are we using it, and is it reaching everybody? I think that's a very, very insightful point. So thank you very much. And yes, now, Pia, how have you seen the work that you're doing, that your company is doing, change since the pandemic? Is that similar to what Sudheer was telling us about, or is it very different?
Thank you so much, and so happy and pleased to be here. And I can actually only echo. I just wrote down what the two of you said, because I will almost repeat what you said. GRUNDFOS is one of the world's biggest pump manufacturers and water solutions providers, and we have a partnership, a well-established partnership with ICSC as well. And I actually think, Sudheer, you said it very well. The technology is there, but is it where it needs to be? And I think actually that's a little bit what I would pull out here as well. Is for me, I think I experienced how we really adapted not the technology itself, but the capabilities and the relationships that we have in many ways and newer ways than we thought. We really thought about, how can we support partners like ICSC. The unit that I head is focused on transforming underserved communities when it comes to water, and of course we then take care of partners like ICRC. So in a supply squeeze that we, for instance, experienced, right in the aftermath a year ago, how do we make sure that partners like ICSC are then prioritized so that people can get access to the basic services they need that you actually mentioned in the beginning, Claire. So I think that's where we really enjoyed the deep partnerships we have also with our supply chain, with our global footprint, and really utilizing the investments that we've made in deep relationships also with ICSC along the way, because that's where a pandemic like this really shows what relationships can stand the test of such a stressful situation. I think also being foundation owned as GRUNDFOS is, it's not a philanthropic arm, it's actually our owners. We really saw a quick shift very quickly already, February, March, where they put all their philanthropic activities towards COVID-19. That was towards protective gear that we 3D printed in our factories. It was towards, on the R&D side, we started supporting sequencing of the virus. Suddenly there was this whole shift towards COVID-19, also from our owners, which of course meant that is something that trickles down to us as well. When our owners sort of say, that way, this is important, something is happening now that we need to tap into and understand what's going on.
Thank you very much. I think what I'm hearing from both of you is really indeed how this pandemic has driven certain innovations and changes in your respective work. And I think that's very interesting. Sudheer, what technologies have you developed and deployed to help countries with some of these challenges you spoke about with access? And what are the new innovations that you see? And maybe you could talk a little about some of the barriers as well, and how we could possibly overcome that.
Yeah. Again, great question, Claire. Again, so and just building a bit more on the partnerships point as well. I mean, for most of the problems that we have and we're dealing with, I mean, of course, it's unless and until there are the right partnerships, both public and private sector, it would be kind of extremely difficult to solve some of the most complex issues that we have, right? So, I mean, as Tabreed itself, what we've been doing, especially a lot more over the last year, is looking at a two broad set of partners, I would say. One is on the urban front, where we provide essentially cooling as a service, and we're looking at providing cooling as a service in developing markets. We work quite closely with the UN Environment Program, right? Where essentially what we're saying is you have cooling growth that has been growing in most emerging countries. That is the largest contributor to energy demand in these countries, from a variety of reasons, because of climate events, because of increasing per capita income, and so on and so forth. And you have a trajectory in terms of how things are being done currently on the ground, and you have an option for having a trajectory which is a lot more sustainable compared to the baseline. And since we've, over the last 20 odd years, kind of developed, I would say, more than just technology in terms of the physical products, we've developed the processes and the business models and innovation around business models to ensure that whatever is out there is made available in the most cost-effective way to provide an essential service like cooling. So what we've been doing a lot more in the last year, I would say, is basically the same set of knowledges and competencies, which is the right partnerships, both public and private sector, having and knowing what possible technology options are there to meet an essential need like cooling globally, ensuring that we could bring them together in a fit for purpose kind of a solution, rolling in financing into it, because again, financing is a key aspect. So we basically own the asset and we finance it, and work with relevant cities and governments across in countries like India to ensure that whatever urban planning and urban growth is happening is done in a more cost-effective, in a more sustainable manner. So a big part of what we're doing is essentially that. We've been working to kind of ensure that all, at least for new greenfield developments that are happening and the urbanization that's happening in most parts of Asia, at least we play a role in whatever way possible to ensure that's done in a more holistic, sustainable way, using district cooling and district energy kind of solutions. So that's what on the urban part of it. Right? Now, beyond that, I mean, if you just look at coal as a necessity, while the earth is warming, the demand for cooling also is substantially increasing. And you have also the demand for cooling in rural parts of most Asian countries, including India, right? I mean, so you look at a country like India again. Even now, up to 40% of the total agri-produce is currently being wasted simply because of the lack of access to reliable cold chains, right? And only about 4% of the country's benefit that can produce from cooling actually benefits from cooling right. And there have been multiple studies, multiple initiatives, multiple policy effort towards trying to address this cold chain issue, but it hasn't worked for various reasons, right? So I think, I mean, what's happening right now, and we're seeing this happen across multiple sectors as well, is trying to apply a systems thinking approach, essentially, where, I mean, trying to solve only for cold chains, like how, for example, alone will not work. The reason why cold chains, for example, have not really taken off in markets so that the produce can benefit from it, or even the vaccine infrastructure available for vaccine distribution can benefit from it, is because of the investment capacity. So there is no investment capacity, for example, farmers and so on, who need to essentially either deploy whatever's out there and also essentially hold their produce to sell it in the market. And now, even if there is the investment capacity, there's no reliable access to energy in most parts of rural India. So okay, fine, you have a sophisticated cold chain, but then if you don't have reliable power, then what's the use of it? And then, of course, and then you don't have market access. It's multiple problems essentially that are interconnected, right? So unless and until these could be looked at holistically, without just necessarily looking at each one in isolation, it probably might end up in us only making the situation probably worse off or just the same. Right? So what we've done, I mean, as one, for example, as an initiative, we call it as a Prana project. Prana is this ancient Indian term that refers to the creative energy that sustains all life form on Earth. Right? So we call it as a Prana project, where we are collaborating again through the Cool Coalition, which is a network of both public, private sector and various institutional actors, trying to enable sustainable and efficient cooling being available in most parts of the world. So through the Cool Coalition and UNEP, we essentially are looking at a demonstration pilot opportunity in South India, where we are saying, while our objective is to resolve the issue of having a reliable cold chain, we know the problems are many. One is we need to solve the energy access problem. We need to solve the capital availability problem. We need to solve possibly also the livelihood problem because of people being able to sustain this. And more importantly, even if something's made available out there on the ground, who will own that infrastructure, who will run that and ensure that over a long term, it can be managed in a sustainable way, right? So we also have the business model and the long-term sustainable aspects, which is completely beyond technology problem as well. So this pilot is one example where we're trying to look at everything in totality and the interconnectedness of all of these. Try essentially develop a project where we bring together various aspects of renewable energy, we bring together various aspects of cold chains, and also local skill development and training to try and make sure that we can address, at least through this one pilot as an example, the access to the cold infrastructure required to make sure either the vaccines get to the places where they need to get to, or even the food that is produced gets to the markets, and the beneficiaries are ultimately the bottom of the pyramid people and not necessarily the value chain only. Right? So this is like one of the examples of what we're looking at, but I'm sure we could talk about on and on about a lot more, but yeah.
Thank you. And I think what you said is so important about systems thinking. And indeed, looking at holistic responses. And I think I've heard that from both of you too, in the necessity to consider all the different components when trying to design a solution. And, so over to you, Pia. I mean, what Sudheer was saying resonates with what you're doing at GRUNDFOS, and what innovations are you developing? And, do you see similar barriers? Do you agree with his view on systems thinking? What's your perspective?
I mean, I definitely agree with that. What I noted here from Sudheer was also, it's beyond technology. So I completely agree with that. I put business model plus technologies plus people, because I think even building on the last question, I ask myself, where are the most vulnerable in this? And it's those who don't even have proper water access yet when it comes to what we are working with. They don't have proper water access in the first place. So it's not as a starting point, a question of new technology. You know, we can bring water to people. That is possible today. It's more about getting it there. And for me, it highlights the importance of water. And if we talk about technology in this, then I would say remote monitoring, remote operation and maintenance of systems. That's something I know ICRC also works with to make sure systems are up and running, and that you can actually keep track of, you know, how sustainably they run over time as well. So something like connectivity, digitalization, to use these big words, I think that was already happening, you know, before the pandemic. But certainly something like this, when you talk the most remote, vulnerable communities, and you actually cannot physically access them because of this extraordinary situation, then that only exacerbates, you know, the path that we're already on, or the need for treading that path and walking down that path. And I think that ties into the business models that Sudheer also mentioned, because that can also help bring down some of the costs of actually maintaining some of these water systems. One of the things we always say is, you know, the upfront cost is always what we end up discussing, but in reality, it's not about, you know, the upfront cost if you're a little tough. It's actually about taking on the responsibility of running a system over time, because a water system would typically be something that you run over decades, you know, so that is the responsibility you take on when you give access to water in a vulnerable community, because otherwise the first time it breaks down, it doesn't work anymore. So I'm completely in agreement with that. I think the only other thing I want to mention under this question is the training journeys, because we've worked a lot with ICSC around capability building and training. We've also hosted in our headquarters in Denmark, you know, delegations from all over the world, from ICSC frontline field staff to join trainings on electricity and installing pumps together with our local technical college. And I think that is something the COVID-19 has really propelled, at least the unit that I sit with, to start offering this online and building our ability to give targeted training to someone like RCSC and other NGOs, really, I would almost say democratizing access, because I know it's one of these things also that NGOs and ICSC also has been concerned about. When you have to fly people into different places, it's only available to a limited number of people. So how do we actually democratize this and really, you know, lift competency and levels everywhere by giving access to good quality training? So that's something I think is really important to talk about as well, that I think has improved during this pandemic.
And if I can just add to that, Claire, I mean, I think so to summarize on the question as well. I mean, the thing is, I would actually just simply say that, I mean, it's more than technology. It is first innovation related to access, the points that you put across, access to business model, access to capital, access to know-how, access to how to do about things, is to capacity, of course. So the capacity challenge is where the opportunity is for innovation, and people and mindset, right? I mean, and I mean, unless and until, and the mindset is already changing, and I think that's gotten accelerated a lot thanks to the pandemic. So that's one of the, I see as the positive offshoots coming out from the pandemic. And so, of course, what you said as the challenges and the access, capacity, and mindset, as those are looked into in a different way, I think the innovation lies exactly there, because we kind of have most of what we need already to address most of the problems that we need to address, in a way.
I think that's very interesting. So maybe I'm going to pose a quick fire question to both of you, just on the challenge to changing mindsets. You know, in your opinion, what would be the biggest barrier to mindset change that you're seeing in the work you're doing today? I mean, it's a bit of a tough question, but, you know, what cocomes to mind? If we ask you first, Pia, and then you, Sudheer.
Thank God.
Yeah, that is a big question. So now I'm first. I kind of want to actually reach back to the system thinking that I think I think people, we were established in 1945. I was honestly a bit surprised at how agile we could suddenly be when this pandemic hit. I think it's about prioritizing the ecosystem. I think that is really, really important. And I actually think people do want to do that, and they can do that. I think you can change mindsets, but I think the biggest challenge is we have to do it together. It's not enough that you do it or I do it or that the water sector does it or that the cooling sector does it. To actually really transform and embrace change, it's sort of a really big systemic mind change that has to happen, and that's why it takes time, right? So I actually think that's the biggest barrier. It's that it somehow has to happen globally and across sectors, because I think for the individual it's not that hard actually. So the barrier is really partnerships, collaboration, trust, and that just takes time.
Yeah, excellent answer. Thank you. Now, Sudheer, the challenge is yours.
I think in large parts I agree with what Pia said, and the thing is, while it's easy to say that, I mean, we need to think more macro and think at a system level, and also change and think change in the way we are thinking about things and so on. I mean, sometimes for all of that to happen, you need a pandemic, right? And it's like, I mean, so it's kind of accelerating the process of essentially bringing about exactly that change that we need to have in our mindset to start thinking on these lines. So it's like, I mean, probably, I mean, while it's not right to be saying it and it's not the right thing to say, like I said, I mean, the good thing coming out of this is basically the accelerated shift towards a more holistic, equitable kind of a mindset that's coming about right now. So yeah, I mean, sometimes, I mean, as much as we think that we could do something, you just need something external to come and change the way we look at things to help us get out of a comfort zone to do something different. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that's so true. Definitely not to, cast any light on how terrible this pandemic has been for people across the world, yet also to realize that indeed it has maybe pushed us out of our comfort zones in ways we needed to be pushed and forced us to think differently and to create these solutions that are more impactful and people-centric and, future focused, because we've seen, what it might mean not to do this. I think exactly, you're absolutely right in this. And so, listening to you now, I feel, and the fact that we're here, a humanitarian organization and two private companies, both working in, difficult places, helping people find more sustainable solutions. What do you both see as the most important way we can help make private-public partnerships more efficient? You're both very much working from this perspective. So what are some of the things do you think can help us do this better? Maybe I'll start with you, Sudheer.
Sure. Yeah, and I think this is something which we've been both dealing with and struggling with a lot, I would say, over the last, 18 months, 2 years, especially in places like India and Southeast Asia, right? And the things, I mean, whilst on one hand, we as a private sector player are going ahead and telling the market and also various government organizations that, I mean, here we are with the appetite to invest, the capacity to invest as much as what is needed to really be able to make sustainable change in terms of how people how urban energy is planned and how cooling requirements are being met. We have the capacity, we have the appetite, we have access to technology, we have basically, and the long-term interest to basically be a partner to ensure that we could bring that and still be able to and achieve what has to be achieved on the ground, right? But the thing is, whilst on one hand we still go ahead with that argument, given the competing priorities, I suppose, that the public sector or governments have between not just this was the other, and also given the fact that, you always have alternative choices in terms of how things can be looked at. It has always been difficult to get the right, I would say, audience with the ability to act in a more impactful way to for example, solve problems that we think are quite important in the overall scheme of things. So yeah, I don't know if there is a simple solution to what could be required to make public-private partnerships work. Some of the things that we started working around, for example, is as a private player as well. We are now partnering with World Bank's IFC essentially to set up an investment platform to invest in cooling as a service, trigeneration, cold chains, etc., and so on in countries like India. And we thought that, IFC was a great fit because they're a part of the World Bank, and they have very good access to various actors, whether within cities, state governments, or central governments, and also, of course, the private sector as well. That kind of is enabling a slightly, I would say, a better flow in terms of how we are having the conversations to really be able to demonstrate why some of the things that we do are really required to be done in an absolutely urgent way. So that is one specific, I would say, a partnership that is kind of helping kind of propel this forward. The second, again, is I think I would probably think that, I mean, the more the voice becomes collective than actually individual. So through the Cool Coalition, through the UN Environment's District Energy and Cities Initiative, for example, that we work on, it kind of, at least, I mean, you have a more of a neutral, independent kind of an organization and a body and the tone of dialogue, if you put it that way, that at least gets across to various players, private or public, to at least make sure that the partnerships can be forged in a more sustainable and a holistic, balanced way, right? So probably, I mean, it's looking for those kind of independent, more impactful organizations that could actually work alongside to kind of do this. And then of course is the rest of the ecosystem that kind of needs to then follow suit to make things happen. So these would be probably our learnings and what we're trying to do and navigate through this maze of trying to make sure that, I mean, we have the right public partners on the ground in places like India to be able to do more good work, essentially.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a very important thing there, which is, yes, to be impactful, you know, and that these coalitions or partnerships are impactful. And I think your Cool Coalition, great name, sounds very much that, you know, that's what it's looking for, impact and bringing together different partners. Yeah.
We do cool things, it needs to be a cool name.
You've got a whole world of things you can say to that. It's great. So Pia, you know, similar question. And, you know, from your perspective, what do you think is needed to help private-public partnerships be more efficient and indeed more impactful? Are there any sort of incentives or ways of working you've seen be more successful than others?
I think it depends on what we mean with public-private partnerships as well, right? Because I certainly consider what we have with ICSC and other NGOs and also public authorities as partnerships, because we work, you know, in frameworks and in mutual trust and through many years and so on and so forth, and do co-creation as well. So I think in that sense, you have partnerships that are more maybe loosely based, but also very tight because you really get to know each other. But if we talk public-private partnerships in the sense, for instance, where we're delivering water over a number of years, or I think more closer to what Sudheer is doing, you know, with these new business models, delayed revenue models, and so on, I think that's a whole another business. We do that as well, and have also been challenged on that under the pandemic, because suddenly water became free. That sort of erodes your entire business model when you have a model that actually relies on getting the money in over, you know, a certain number of years. So I think that that one of the things we struggle with is still, you know, what is the role of private sector when we're talking these very vulnerable populations, and in the partnerships with NGOs, in the partnerships with local authorities, because I think that area may still be in need of more development and recognition of what is each partner's play here, what is each partner's role and responsibility here, and then how do we secure that I feel the traction that public-private partnerships have received these past years, how do we keep that momentum going? Because, you know, when something like suddenly, you know, there's no income in a project that we're doing, then of course, how do we now move on to the next one? So maybe the big question for me is also, how do you move from that pilot that we all, I think, do, and great that we have also access to different types of finance to explore, you know, these edges of commercial viability. I think that is fantastic that we have gained more access to these types of funds as well, you know, risk capital that's willing to go into exploring these edges. But at the same time, you know, I really feel there's still this gap from the pilot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 systems to actually scaling and getting to that type of impact that I think you're talking about, Claire. And I don't have the recipe for that, but maybe it's also, you know, you're building trust, relationships, and doing that amongst partners that are also not used to working together, and really talking about the roles and responsibilities and agreeing on those as well. Because obviously, as a commercial business, when suddenly you don't get your money back, that's a huge issue. That's our survival. That's how we secure the jobs for everyone who works, and so on and so forth. And then we can't scale. So I fully recognize, you know, that water is a human right. I think that's actually one of the big takeaways from this pandemic is that it has to be a human right. And I fully understand why water becomes free when something like this happens. So what do we do then? I think that's the question. So it's not really a finger pointing. It's more like a, what do we do? You know, like when you need to get vaccines to people and suddenly someone can't pay, what do you do? I mean, you want to get the vaccines there, and you're not gonna, you know, pull the thing out of the plug and ruin the vaccines. You know, it's what do you do? Because we each have you know, different logics that we need to work by to be able to scale. So I think for me that's the big question. Maybe we just need to get to know each other better and find out how that collaboration actually needs to work. That might enable us to find the solutions where everybody is comfortable with the role and responsibility they have in that partnership.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's very important, as you were saying, we've got to be practical and pragmatic in the ways we work, and, you know, acknowledge that we are different kinds of organizations and actors, and maybe we go about things slightly differently. That doesn't mean we can't have shared goals or outcomes. It might just mean the way we get there depends on what sort of organizations we are. So I think you both illustrated that very well in terms of how you've responded to the pandemic. So I do think, yeah, it's a tough question. So we've got about, I don't know, just under 10 minutes left. I'd like to see if anyone from the audience has any questions. I'm just going to have a quick look at the Q&A box. And in the meantime, I'd ask both of you, Sudheer, and how, I mean, we're talking a lot about what are the critical changes needed. I mean, how do you think us as individuals can make a substantial difference in some of these areas, not just as companies or organizations, but as individuals to a more sustainable recovery? And I know it's a huge question, but just, you know, from the perspective of you and your company, what would you say to that, Sudheer? And then we'll go to you, Pia, and I'll just be checking the Q&A box as well.
I mean, as individuals, Claire, I mean, I would just say the only thing that probably, it begins with, again, mindset. So probably, I mean, just working on that to having a more inclusive, holistic, and positive outlook towards how you'd like to see your role in the world, not towards and how you interact with the resources that you use and the people that you interact with, so on, probably could be a great starting point before anything else in terms of policy and et cetera, right? So yeah, I don't know, probably, I mean, I would start there personally to continue to work on that positive, pragmatic, balanced, inclusive kind of a mindset. And the more that happens, I would think that the more it would actually automatically enable that change. Yeah, so.
No, I think that's a brilliant answer, because it is, isn't it? It's about, yeah, building out those kind of behaviors that are in fact as important for what we're talking about in terms of, yeah, partnerships between big organizations. So I think that's, yeah, very insightful answer. Thank you. Pia, what would you say to that? Quite difficult question.
Yeah, but I'll almost just echo, you know, what was already said, because even relationships and partnerships between organizations, it ends up being partnerships and relationships between people. So I think almost also saying what we talked about earlier, you know, with prioritizing to protect the ecosystem, whether or not that's around yourself as a person, around you as an organization, or community, society, you know, pull together and take broader responsibility. I think that's what it's about, whether or not it's you alone or as an organization. It all comes down to people, however way you turn it.
Very true. Thank you. In our audience, I've seen there was a point made by a participant, which I think is very important. We haven't spoke about it so much. saying, it's very important also to consider government in all of this. And I think, the person who posed that is exactly right. That is also part of this, as you spoke about, holistic kind of system that we all need to be part of. And then there was another question, and that was more of a suggestion. I think it's a very good suggestion. And there was another question to you both on, in 5 years' time, what do you think needs to be done? What would you like to see being done differently from the perspective of your kind of the work you're doing, and also the impact of this pandemic on that work? So I'll start with you, Sudheer, and then back to you, Pia.
I think I'd love to see a world where basically, a value is not measured only in shareholder value, which I think is changing quite rapidly. And I think, and there being enough tools, metrics, and ways to kind of measure the actual cost, not just in terms of money, but the cost in terms of the impact that we create from our action on the environment and the societies around us. The more and more that can be simplified to make it as a part of the overall equation of how we measure growth and sustainability and so on and so forth. I think the better it would be to just make everything inclusive. So yeah, in 5 years from now, if magically suddenly every large corporation says that what I care about is not just my bottom line, but basically about this formula which measures shared value and so on, and that becomes the norm pretty much across the world, it'll be awesome.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry to interrupt there. I agree. I think that's brilliant, because it's about shared goals. It's about global goods, social goods that are as important as all of our bottom lines. So Thank you. Pia.
Right, I can't beat that. That's got to be the last word, I think that's a good answer, because I think we're all trying to find the shared value and understanding each other better. So I think I'll just echo that and hope that we always say that the travel is bad for the environment because of the climate and so on. But to be honest, I miss this interpersonal interaction, which I think is going to have to happen for exactly tighter relationships, better understanding, and finding shared value when we have different ways of operating. I think we have to meet face to face as well to understand each other's reality. So I, for once, honestly look forward to actually joining the rest of the world again.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. Exactly. I think, we've all learned different ways to do our jobs virtually. We've overcome many challenges, but personally, I don't think you can replace that human relationship aspect. And as you say, how important it is for partnership. I'm not going to try and wrap up what you said, but what I've really heard that really strikes me is indeed this necessity for partnerships and relationships that are about people. And also this idea of looking at the system and the interplay between the different parts of that in a holistic way. I like what you said, Sudheer, about everything in totality. And I think, Pia, your examples show us quite how important that interoperability between us all is. So I think, it's been very interesting to talk to you both. I hope it's not the last time. We already work with GRUNDFOS. I hope we'll work also with Tabreed. And I think, if that's a positive aspect of the pandemic, that people do step outside their comfort zones and look for solutions together, again, I think that's a good thing if we can say it like that. And the more sustainable ways we can develop together to overcome some of these challenges, the better it will be. So, again, thank you very much. I didn't see too many more questions, but I apologize to the audience if we didn't get to your question. We, obviously don't have a huge amount of time, but thank you all very much for being here with us as well. And it's a shame we can't all see each other in actual person, but I'm sure we'll see each other again. Thank you very much.